Hey everyone, welcome to my Holy Week reflection, the next in a series of reflections from our staff here at Third, talking about where our minds move and where our minds travel during this week on the church calendar. There's so many places throughout history and today where we can go and find God's presence, so thought I'd share that with you guys today. So a story that I always get brought back to, one that my youth kids know, and some of you may have heard, that I tell around this time of year, is when I was on a trip to Israel as part of my undergraduate degree at Lee University. So a few years ago, we went to Israel on an 11-day trip, and the last few days we were in Jerusalem for 5 days in a row. And we went to the Garden of Gethsemane, which if you've never been, which I know some people here have, but most have probably not, there's the Church of Many Nations, a little alleyway, and then a stoned gated off section of a garden full of olive trees. I think there's a baptismal font, an area for devotions and preaching. It's a beautiful place. And it's locked by this gate, so you have to get one of the priests from the church to come and unlock it for you. So we go in there, we do a devotion with our group, and then we go off on our own to pray for a while. I put headphones in to listen to some calming praise music and just was praying. Very in the moment with God, tears rolling down my eyes, just the experience was overwhelming. And I look up about 10 minutes later, and there is not a single other person in the garden. My group of 20 plus people, nowhere to be found, no father to unlock the gate for me. So when I walked up to it, I was literally locked in the Garden of Gethsemane. Eventually they came back and found me, but this always brings me to Jesus during his time in the Garden of Gethsemane. We have this story in all the Gospels, but in Luke's Gospel especially, we see the humanness of God. As we know, he's 100% man and 100% divine. We see his humanness showing. He starts to sweat blood. He asks the Father and prays, and sometimes we may think God just prayed, or Jesus prayed in a quiet voice, but I imagine him crying out for the Father to take this cup, this burden, this death he was about to experience away from him. And when he does this, he ends saying, "Nevertheless, not my will done, but yours," or at least a version of those kind of words. Basically what we say in our prayer, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." We get from this experience of Jesus the deep meaning of what those words mean. Yes, we can say, "God, just come and do your work, make this place great." But what we're actually saying when we say those words, something I've been battling with very recently soon, is giving up any idea of what we think that might look like. Giving up our good thoughts of it, giving up our bad thoughts of it, ascribing worth to what God's will is, saying, well, that's God's will, but this wasn't God's will. Everything in the past and everything that is right now, we have to assume and we have to know, and as Christians we have to believe that that is God's will, that was God's will. And whatever takes place in the future is God's will unfolding in front of us. And Christ knew that. He modeled that. Even though every emotion in his being, every feeling in his body, every desire that he had in that moment was to not die, was to not be tortured, was to not be betrayed by one of his closest friends. So much so that not only was he having what we would describe as a panic or anxiety attack, but he was sweating blood. A thing that can happen to people, but under excessively dire circumstances. Yet at the end of his prayer, Jesus said, "Your will be done, not mine." My desire, my deep fear, don't feed into that, God. Let your will be done. Take away my ascribing of worth to it. Take away my judgment of it. I do not get to judge what your will is. I do not get to judge whether it is good or whether it is bad. Just do it. So there's so many other things that come up in this conversation of what God's will is, permission versus cause, whatever might happen, how to ordain our future steps so that we can be the instruments through which God's will is done, as he has shown he has used humans forever to do and perform and plan out his will. his plan for this world through people. He uses us, which is beautiful. But what I always reflect on when I'm in this conversation is just that I want to end every day looking back and saying, God, thank you so much for doing your will. There are times I liked it, I'm sure. There are times I didn't. But regardless of my feelings, thank you for doing your will. And then tomorrow, please do it again. Disregard how I may feel about it. Help me not to care so much. Help me to have less contempt in my heart if I disagree with what's happening. Help me to find the strength to change it if that is your will as well. But God, at the end of the day, at the end of every night, let your will be done. That's how we got the cross. That's how we got Christ as our Savior. That's how we got the ability to get on our knees, ask for forgiveness, and get it at the snap of a finger. It's by saying, not my will, but yours be done.